Picture this. You're sitting in traffic, already late for an important meeting, when someone cuts you off and gives you the finger. Your blood pressure spikes, your hands grip the steering wheel, and suddenly your entire day feels ruined. But what if I told you there's a way to experience that same situation and feel absolutely nothing? Not numbness, not suppression, but genuine inner peace that makes external chaos completely powerless over you. Today, we're diving deep into one of Carl Jung's most revolutionary psychological concepts that can transform how you respond to life's inevitable frustrations, disappointments, and attacks. This isn't about pretending nothing bothers you or becoming emotionally dead inside. This is about developing what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain centered and unshakable regardless of what the world throws at you. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how to cultivate this superpower that separates emotionally mature people from those who get triggered by every small inconvenience. You'll learn the 3 pillars of Jung's approach, discover why most people fail at emotional control, and walk away with practical techniques you can start using today. But before we begin, let me ask you something. How many hours of your life have you lost to anger, frustration, or worry about things completely outside your control? How many relationships have suffered because you couldn't manage your emotional reactions? How many opportunities have you missed because you were too caught up in your feelings about what someone said or did? The truth is, most of us are emotional slaves without even realizing it. We hand over our peace of mind to random strangers, difficult family members, traffic jams, social media posts, and news headlines. We've been conditioned to believe that external events should determine our internal state. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss completely. The things that bother us most aren't actually about the external situation at all. They're about unintegrated parts of our own psyche that we've pushed into what he called the shadow. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we're not really angry about the traffic violation. We're triggered because that person represents something we hate about ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. Think about it. Why does that aggressive driver bother you so much? Could it be because you have your own aggressive tendencies that you've labeled as unacceptable? Why does someone's arrogance trigger such a strong reaction? Might it be because you have your own arrogant moments that you're ashamed to admit? Jung called this projection, and it's the reason why identical situations can trigger completely different reactions in different people. The person who cuts you off might not even register as a blip on someone else's emotional radar, while it ruins your entire morning. The difference isn't in the situation itself, but in what unintegrated shadow material gets activated within you. This brings us to the first pillar of Jung's approach to emotional mastery: shadow integration. Most people try to become unshakable by suppressing their reactions or pretending they don't care. This creates what Jung called a false persona, a mask we wear to appear more composed than we actually are. But this approach always fails because the shadow material remains unintegrated and continues to control us from the unconscious. Real emotional freedom comes from acknowledging and integrating these shadow aspects of ourselves. When you can honestly admit that you have aggressive tendencies, selfish moments, and petty thoughts, these qualities in others lose their power to trigger you. You stop taking things personally because you understand that other people's behavior is about their own internal struggles, not about you. The process of shadow integration isn't comfortable. It requires brutal honesty about parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But here's what happens when you do this work consistently. The things that used to send you into emotional tailspins start feeling like background noise. You develop what Jung called objective consciousness, the ability to observe situations without being consumed by your emotional reactions to them. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Imagine your boss criticizes your work in front of your colleagues. The traditional approach would be to either explode with anger or swallow your feelings and let resentment build. But someone who has integrated their shadow might respond completely differently. They would first notice their initial emotional reaction without judgment. Then they would ask themselves what this situation is triggering within them. Perhaps it's activating their own inner critic that they've never fully acknowledged. Maybe it's bringing up childhood memories of feeling humiliated by authority figures. Or it could be highlighting their own perfectionist tendencies that make any criticism feel like a personal attack. By understanding what's really happening internally, they can respond from a place of consciousness rather than reactivity. They might acknowledge the criticism, ask clarifying questions, or simply let it pass without taking it on as part of their identity. The key is that their response comes from awareness, not from unconscious emotional patterns. This leads us to the second pillar of Jung's approach, individuation. This is perhaps his most important concept, and it's the foundation of true emotional freedom. Individuation is the process of becoming who you really are, rather than who you think you should be or who others expect you to be. Most of our emotional reactivity comes from trying to maintain a false version of ourselves. We get upset when situations threaten our carefully constructed identity or when people don't see us the way we want to be seen. But when you're on the path of individuation, external validation becomes less important because you're developing a relationship with your authentic self. Jung believed that we each have an inner guidance system. He called the self with a capital S. This isn't your ego or your personality, but something deeper and more reliable. When you learn to tune into this inner voice, external circumstances lose much of their power to disturb your peace. The individuation process involves separating yourself from collective expectations and cultural conditioning. It means discovering your own values, your own purpose, and your own way of being in the world. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or antisocial. It means becoming so centered in your authentic self that you can engage with others from a place of genuine choice rather than unconscious reactivity. Here's what this looks like in practice. Instead of getting defensive when someone disagrees with you, you become curious about their perspective. Instead of feeling threatened by criticism, you evaluate it objectively to see if there's anything useful to learn. Instead of needing everyone to like you, you become comfortable with the fact that authenticity sometimes creates friction. The beautiful paradox is that the more individuated you become, the less you need to defend your individuality. You stop taking things personally because you understand that most of what people say and do has nothing to do with you. You develop what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your own thoughts and feelings and those of others. Now let's explore the third pillar, active imagination. This was Jung's technique for engaging with unconscious material in a conscious way. Most people are at the mercy of their unconscious reactions because they never learned how to work with their psyche intentionally. Active imagination involves creating a dialogue with the parts of yourself that usually remain hidden. When something bothers you, instead of just feeling upset, you can explore the reaction through imagination. You might visualize the part of you that's triggered and ask it what it needs or what it's trying to protect. For example, if someone's rudeness triggers anger in you, you might imagine your anger as a character and have a conversation with it. What is this anger protecting? What does it need you to understand? What would it look like to honor this energy without being controlled by it? This practice helps you develop a conscious relationship with your emotional patterns instead of being unconsciously driven by them. You start to understand that every emotional reaction contains information about your psyche. Instead of trying to suppress or act out these reactions, you can learn from them. The goal isn't to eliminate emotions, but to become conscious of them. Jung believed that consciousness was the highest human achievement, and emotional mastery is simply one expression of expanded consciousness. When you understand the deeper patterns driving your reactions, you gain the power to choose your responses. But here's where most people get stuck. They try to apply these concepts intellectually without doing the deeper work of actually facing their shadow material. They read about individuation without having the courage to challenge their own conditioning. They learn about active imagination, but never actually sit with their uncomfortable emotions long enough to understand what they're trying to communicate. Real transformation requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposing forces within yourself without immediately trying to resolve it. This means feeling your anger without immediately expressing it or suppressing it. It means noticing your fear without immediately running from it or fighting it. It means experiencing your sadness without immediately trying to fix it or ignore it. This capacity to hold tension is what allows you to respond rather than react. When someone pushes your buttons, instead of immediately defending or attacking, you can pause and ask yourself what's really happening. What old wound is being activated? What pattern is trying to play out? What would a conscious response look like in this situation? The practice of holding tension also applies to external situations. Instead of immediately labeling things as good or bad, right or wrong, you can develop the capacity to hold complexity. Maybe your difficult coworker is both annoying and struggling with personal issues. Maybe that criticism you received contains both unfair judgments and valuable feedback. Maybe that disappointing situation is both painful and an opportunity for growth. This nuanced way of seeing prevents you from getting trapped in black and white thinking that often fuels emotional reactivity. When you can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, you become much less likely to get hooked by any single interpretation of events. Let me share a story that illustrates how this works in real life. A friend of mine was going through a difficult divorce and felt triggered every time her ex-husband would text her about custody arrangements. His messages felt cold and businesslike, which activated her feelings of rejection and abandonment. Instead of responding from reactivity, she started using Jung's techniques. She recognized that her ex's communication style was triggering her own abandonment wounds from childhood. She used active imagination to dialogue with the part of her that felt rejected, giving it the acknowledgement it needed. She also worked on individuating from the cultural expectation that divorced couples should be friends. Over time, she developed the ability to receive his messages without taking them personally. She understood that his distant communication style was his way of managing his own difficult emotions, not a reflection of her worth. This shift allowed her to respond practically to custody issues without getting emotionally hijacked by each interaction. The transformation wasn't immediate, but with consistent practice, what used to ruin her entire day became a minor inconvenience she could handle with equanimity. This is what Jung meant by psychological development, not the absence of challenges, but the increased capacity to meet challenges without losing your center. Now let's talk about some common obstacles people encounter when trying to apply these principles. The first is spiritual bypassing, using psychological concepts to avoid feeling difficult emotions. Some people hear about emotional mastery and think it means never feeling angry, sad, or afraid. But Jung emphasized that the goal is conscious feeling, not the absence of feeling. The second obstacle is perfectionism. People expect themselves to immediately stop being triggered by anything, and when they inevitably have emotional reactions, they judge themselves for failing. But developing emotional mastery is a lifelong process, not a destination you arrive at once and for all. The third obstacle is isolation. Some people interpret individuation to mean becoming completely independent and not caring about anyone's opinion. But true individuation actually makes you more capable of genuine intimacy and connection, because you're no longer relating from neediness or defensiveness. The fourth obstacle is spiritual materialism, using Jung's concepts as another way to build ego rather than transcend it. Some people become proud of their emotional control or use their psychological insights to feel superior to others. This actually indicates that the ego has co-opted the individuation process for its own purposes. To avoid these traps, it's important to approach this work with humility and patience. Remember that everyone is struggling with their own unconscious patterns, including you. The goal isn't to become perfect, but to become more conscious. It's not about never being triggered, but about recovering more quickly when you are triggered. Here are some practical techniques you can start using today to develop these capacities. First, practice the pause. When you feel yourself getting emotionally activated, take 3 deep breaths before responding. This simple practice creates space between stimulus and response, giving your consciousness a chance to engage. Second, develop a daily practice of self-reflection. Spend a few minutes each day reviewing your emotional reactions and asking yourself what they might be revealing about your unconscious patterns. What triggered you today? What would you have done differently? What did you learn about yourself? Third, practice perspective taking. When someone's behavior bothers you, try to imagine what might be driving their actions from their perspective. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it helps you avoid taking things personally and respond more skillfully. Fourth, cultivate what Jung called the witness consciousness. Throughout your day, practice observing your thoughts and emotions without immediately identifying with them. Notice when you're feeling angry without thinking, I am angry. Notice when you're feeling sad without thinking, I am sad. This subtle shift helps you maintain some psychological distance from your emotional states. Fifth, engage in regular shadow work. Make a list of the qualities you most dislike in other people. Then honestly examine whether you might have those same qualities in some form. This isn't about self-judgment, but about integration and self-awareness. Remember, the goal of this work isn't to become emotionally numb or detached from life. It's to develop what Jung called conscious living, the ability to engage fully with life while maintaining your psychological sovereignty. You can care deeply about things without being controlled by them. You can feel your emotions fully without being dominated by them. When you master these principles, something beautiful happens. You stop wasting energy on things you can't control and become much more effective at influencing things you can control. You stop taking other people's behavior personally and become more capable of genuine compassion. You stop defending a false version of yourself and become comfortable with your authentic humanity. This is Jung's vision of psychological maturity, not the absence of problems, but the conscious engagement with life's inevitable challenges. It's the difference between being tossed around by every external circumstance and maintaining your center regardless of what's happening around you. The journey of developing emotional mastery is ongoing, but every step along the way brings greater freedom and peace. Start small, be patient with yourself, and remember that consciousness is always expanding. What bothers you intensely today might barely register as a blip on your radar 6 months from now. The power to remain unshakable isn't about building thicker armor or becoming more emotionally distant. It's about developing such a deep understanding of your own psyche that external circumstances lose their power to knock you off balance. This is Jung's greatest gift to humanity, the recognition that consciousness is always evolving, and we each have the capacity to participate consciously in that evolution.